My name is Rachel Whitaker, and I spent the last decade trying to forget the family I left behind. But standing now in the luxurious ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel, watching my younger sister Daphne twirl in her wedding dress, I realize that some wounds have never been sincerely healed. 10 years is the time I've devoted to building my life, running away from the attachments that once clung to my past. But all this seemed insignificant and ridiculous against the background of this evening's party scene, which literally towered over my life like a building against a deserted horizon. Everything was alien and far away. You're nothing without us, Rachel. You owe us everything. My mother Miriam's voice cut through the chatter of the crowd, sharp as a scalpel, painfully and ruthlessly. I gripped the champagne glass so tightly that my fingers turned white, trying to keep calm. What was I supposed to say? She wasn't going to hear it. I didn't want to face those old reproaches again, those constant accusations that merged into one, almost like a refrain in a song. Miriam has never been able to speak calmly, always that playful, venomous tone, as if she was right and I was to blame. I don't owe you anything, Mom, I replied, lowering my voice, trying to hide the irritation that had long been a part of me. I built my life on my own terms. Her eyes narrowed like those of a predator ready to attack. Her perfectly made-up lips curled into a grin, and it was worse than any reproaches. There was not an ounce of love in her gaze, only reproach and contempt. That's what you tell yourself to sleep at night, she said, looking at me with an expression of complete confidence in her rightness. You're some kind of self-made success, Rachel. You forget who you are, who you really are. I clenched my teeth and turned away. I don't want her to say that in front of everyone. And then Daphne appeared next to her, her veil trailing behind her like a spider's web, gently falling to the floor like something invisible and fragile, but important. I could never understand why she chose such thin, airy things to be beautiful when everything around needed strength. She was smiling, fake sweetness dripped from every syllable. Her voice was like honey, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, Rachel, she said, coming closer, I'm so glad you could do this. I was worried that you'd be too busy with your own business. That you're consulting again? I sighed, trying not to show how much I was annoyed by her way of speaking. I run my own tech company, I replied, silently watching as her face momentarily became as impassive as her mother's. Daphne waved her hand dismissively, as if it were unimportant. Well, isn't it nice that you can spend time away from your little things to celebrate your only sister's special day? I forced myself to smile. I wouldn't miss it for the world, I replied. But there was something about that phrase that sounded hollow, even to me. Miriam, as always, could not stay in the shadows, and, standing up, began to look around the room, trying to find the right moment for a new attack. Where's your husband, Eli? What is it? She asked. Does he park the car? I nodded silently, wishing Eli would hurry up and join me in this lion's den. But I had neither the strength nor the desire to think about him at that moment. He was like a shadow, always present, but never in the foreground. Daphne's fiancé, Clive, came over to our little group. His arm was wrapped around my sister's waist, and he was smiling as if life was one big game for him, which he always wins. Rachel, it's so nice to finally meet you in person, he said, holding out his hand as if he expected me to be happy to meet him. I doubted it, but I shook his hand anyway. Congratulations on your big day, I said. But what could I say? That this day was important to me? It was just another show in which I played a role like everyone else. I felt Eli's hand on my lower back. His touch was confident but gentle, as a reminder that there is someone who supports me. He said quietly, You didn't do a bad job for yourself, Rachel. His tone was light but firm as always, and I couldn't help but notice that he was really proud of me. Miriam grinned and said her favorite phrase, as if Eli and I were playing different games. Yes, well, some of us put family above personal gain. Her words hung in the air, heavy with years of resentment and unspoken accusations. I felt my shoulders tighten, ready to defend myself. But before I could answer, the wedding planner came into the room and politely ushered Daphne in for photos. My mother's gaze stayed on me, and I could hear her muttering so that only I could hear. "Do you think you can just walk away from your family? We made you who you are." Those words echoed in my mind like old memories that I had been trying to get out of my life for so long. I watched them leave, and a mixture of emotions bubbled inside me, from anger to despair. I squeezed the glass, feeling Eli squeeze my hand again. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice soft as always when he wanted to comfort me. I nodded, forcing a smile, even though everything was screaming inside. "I'm fine. It's just one day," I said, and the words sounded fake, even to me. When I looked around the room, in which it seemed that every glance was intended to condemn me, I couldn't help feeling that all this wouldn't end today, that this day was just the beginning. The past, like an unbearable burden, remained with us, and I could not get rid of what I was so desperately trying to forget. Everything inside me screamed, "They're still here, they're still around, and this can't be the end." The wedding reception continued, and I felt the suffocating atmosphere fill me again. People were talking around, but it was hard for me to concentrate. I couldn't stay there, couldn't look at all those smiles and hypocrisy. I looked for shelter and headed to the balcony of the hotel, where Eli followed. The night air was cold, and I inhaled it with pleasure, as if for the first time all evening I was inhaling something real. His hand rested soothingly on my shoulder, as if he knew that this was what I needed at that moment, silence and support. I pressed myself against the railing and closed my eyes. My mother's words echoed in my head again. "Do you think you can just walk away from your family? We made you who you are." They continued to torment me as if they were alive, and I couldn't stop them. Eli stood beside her, his voice softly cutting through the silence. "Do you want to talk about it?" I took a deep breath, shoulders sagging wearily. It's that I'm here, seeing them again. Everything comes back, no matter how hard I try to forget." Memories flooded back, and comparisons with Daphne filled my head again. I couldn't help but think about how they always compared us, how Miriam put me in the shadow of her beloved daughter, how her sarcastic remarks about my appearance, about my choice, about my very existence destroyed me. Every time Miriam's eyes lit up at the sight of Daphne, I took a back seat. She was always on a pedestal, and I was in her shadow. And then my sister's voice rang out again. Daphne appeared in the doorway, flute in hand with champagne, and she, as always, tried to demonstrate her role as a victim. "You're always so dramatic, Rachel," she accused, and I felt old resentments flare up with renewed vigor. She was standing in the doorway, still pretending to be an innocent victim, with a cold, calculating look that I know well. It was like a pistol shot, precise, relentless. "After all these years, I've improved," I said with barely suppressed contempt. "You can't blame me. I steal by myself, I don't play anything, Daphne, I live on my own terms." She laughed, but it sounded fragile and forced, as if she couldn't contain her nervousness. "Oh, please," she replied, curling her lips into a fake smile. "You ran away because you couldn't accept that you weren't the center of attention for once. That's what you tell yourself to justify your failure." Her words pierced me, but I couldn't answer anymore. I looked at her as an old enemy, and I knew that nothing would change. I nodded, trying to draw strength from his words, but the doubts still remained poisonous, like poisonous arrows piercing my mind. They were whispering somewhere in the back of my mind if I had really succeeded despite my family, or if I was still that scared little girl in desperate need of approval. And so, as if for a second, everything went dark around me, and I found myself back where I once was, on the sidelines of my life, cornered by those I couldn't forget. Clive appeared immediately. His smile was a little too wide, as if he couldn't resist showing everyone how much he enjoyed this moment. He was a skillfully trained player, and it was obvious from the very beginning. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere for you, Rachel." His voice was full of courtesy, but I sensed a hidden tension in it. "I was hoping that we could talk about a business proposal." I exchanged a glance with Eli, and he said softly, "I appreciate the interest, but now is not the time and place." Clive waved his hand dismissively. "Nonsense. There is no better time to discuss the future than at a wedding." He continued with such fervor that it made me uneasy. Yes, I have some ideas that can really benefit both of us. Noticing the genuine tension in his voice, I remembered how his gaze had swept over me a few minutes ago, a barely concealed calculation that I couldn't ignore. I needed to crawl away from this situation somehow. I'm sorry, Clive, but the answer is no, I said firmly, this time not letting my will waver. I'm not interested in any business ventures right now. His smile faltered for a moment before he regained his senses, as if his feelings were only superficial, but then he tried again to perpetuate this business interest. Well, think about it, his voice sounded urgent. Shouldn't your family help the family? After all, we all have to support each other, don't we? When he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his offer than just the usual business interest. There was something in his gaze, in his gestures, that betrayed ulterior motives. I told myself that family should not be an anchor, but rather a support, but at the moment it felt like a threat, not a fertile place for growth and trust. Eli squeezed my hand, his warm touch comforting as always. Are you okay? What is it? He asked, his voice soft, almost inaudible. I took a deep breath and squared my shoulders, at that moment feeling the inner fortress begin to revive. We both knew that I couldn't just forget, but at that moment it was important not to succumb to provocations. I'm going, I said, let's go back to the house. I have a feeling that this night is far from over. When we returned to the reception area, I noticed Miriam, who was watching us closely. Her eyes were cold, calculating, full of secret expectation. She always played her own games, and today was probably no exception. Whatever was going on in this room, I knew one thing: I was ready not to participate in their manipulations. It seemed to me that the front line that I had drawn in my life was now completely drawn, and now it was time to show everyone exactly who I had become, Rachel Whitaker. The wedding reception continued. People were having fun talking and drinking champagne, but I couldn't get rid of the anxiety that gripped me. Clive's earlier suggestion wouldn't leave me alone. It was still sitting in my head like a piece of a puzzle that didn't quite match. I was making my way through the crowd, trying to push this thought away, when I felt someone squeezing my hand again. You could have been a part of this, Rachel, if you'd stayed true, Miriam's voice hissed in my ear, his words steeped in manipulation. I turned to face her, trying not to let my emotions run wild, and keeping my voice low and firm, I replied. I've never been faithful to what you think is true, Mom. He smiled, his gaze was cunning and confident, like a man who is used to getting what he wants, regardless of the means. There's something impressive about your tech firm, he said, his voice spreading, soft but insistent. Government contracts that can open doors for other businesses. The realization that Clive was hinting at the need for access to his company's connections was like a cold stone in his stomach. He wouldn't have been so insistent if he hadn't known that I was at least thinking. His tone was cautious, but I sensed something more in him, hidden behind a facade of courtesy. Clive shrugged, feigning nonchalance, but I could see a shadow of tension on his face. Let's just say there are certain medical advances that could use an accelerated path through regulatory approval, he continued. And at that moment, I felt my anger begin to build up, like a thick fog wave ready to engulf everything around me. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a moral test. That's the thing, I said, not hiding my irritation. You want to use my company to push through questionable treatment? Now? In response to my words, Miriam inserted her sugary sweet voice, which I knew well, this tone that always hid a threat. Don't be so dramatic, Rachel, she said. Clive is offering you a chance to help your family, isn't he? That's what you've always wanted, to be useful. An old resentment flared up inside me, but I suppressed it. I forced myself not to answer, even though everything in me was screaming. I didn't need their help, and I didn't want to be someone's pawn. I'm not interested in being useful if it means threatening my ethics or the reputation of my company, I replied firmly, and my voice sounded like a severed thread, irrevocably cut off. Clive's facade is slightly cracked. It was as if he sensed that I had strayed from his path. Think carefully, he said, his voice becoming a little more insistent. The family should help the family. After all, It would be a shame if certain information about your past came to light. It was a threat, clear and straightforward as a whip. I felt a surge of protective anger, not only at myself, but at everything I had built. It was more than just a suggestion. It was an interference with my boundaries. "Are you threatening me, Clive?" I asked, and my voice was dangerously calm. He stepped back a little, as if realizing that he had gone too far. "Of course not, I'm just pointing out the benefits of cooperation," he said, trying to regain his confidence. But I didn't back down. My silence was as hard as a rock. "Let me be very clear," I began, meeting his gaze. "I will not be blackmailed or manipulated in any way. My past is just the past. My present and future are my own." Miriam took a step forward, her face now cold and tense. Her voice became low and venomous. "You ungrateful child," she whispered. "After everything we've done for you, you've ruined everything you could have achieved." Her words echoed in my mind, but I no longer felt the pain. Years of pent-up frustration simmering on the surface meant constant criticism and manipulation. I saw how they pitted Daphne and me against each other, how they took advantage of us, playing on our weaknesses. I'd been holding back this anger all my life, but now I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I was standing in the center of the room, and even though heads were turning in our direction, I couldn't stop. I said, "I built my life and my success in spite of you, not because of you, and I won't let you or anyone else threaten that." Miriam fell silent, but a malicious spark flashed in her eyes. Clive, trying to regain control, smiled, but now his smile was no longer so confident. I knew I needed to hold on, that this night was far from over, and that we were all just getting started, but now I was ready to fight for what had become mine. Rachel turned to Daphne, and the confusion on her face became more and more obvious. "What does she want from her? What is it all about? What are you talking about?" Rachel asked, feeling her words become as heavy as stones in her chest. Daphne laughed bitterly, and there was a long-standing resentment in her voice, not hidden even behind the facade of a fake smile. "Oh, don't play dumb, Rachel. It doesn't suit you. You knew about our financial problems. Mom has been trying to contact you for months." Daphne's words cut through like a knife, and everything began to form a single picture. Clive's clerical suggestion, Miriam's manipulations, the old game hidden behind smiles and conversations about family values. All of a sudden, it wasn't so random. Rachel felt a cold despair seep into her soul with every word. But she didn't even know what to say. "Honestly, no one told me anything," Rachel managed, but she realized how unconvincing it sounded. Daphne didn't hide her anger. The facade of her coldness cracked, exposing a vulnerability Rachel hadn't seen in years. "We're drowning, Rachel," she exhaled sharply, her voice cracking with inner pain. "Mom's medical bills, Dad's failed investments, this wedding, it's all smoke and mirrors." Daphne grabbed Rachel's sleeve, and she felt her fingers, seemingly unsure, cling to her. A pang of guilt shot through Rachel for a moment, but anger followed more quickly, the flames of which flared up with renewed vigor. "So you want me to solve all your problems?" Rachel almost didn't recognize her own voice, as if she hadn't spoken it. "Are you going to accuse me of helping you out at my sister's wedding?" Daphne exhaled loudly, and Rachel noticed how her eyes filled with tears and her voice soared up. "We didn't know what else to do," her words sounded like the last hope. "You are the one who has a successful company, an ideal life. We thought that you would come and save us. We were hoping that you would help." Rachel felt as if something was bursting in her heart. It couldn't be that Daphne really considered her the only salvation. It couldn't be that she was looking at her like that, with that blind, bitter expectation. A mixture of shame and resentment flashed in her sister's eyes, and it seemed to Rachel that she was trying to say something more than just words. "You left us, Rachel," her voice was rough with bitterness. "You left and never looked back." Rachel took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions that was bubbling inside her. But the bitterness of Daphne's accusations did not let go. "I left because I had to," Rachel replied. As we stood there, the three of us locked in a tense confrontation, I suddenly realized that this wedding had become something much more than just a family reunion. It was something that did not fit into the framework of an ordinary ceremony. It was a reckoning with my past, with the lodges we all lived in, with the harsh truth that we had avoided for too long. The real battle had just begun, and I was determined to face it, no matter what the cost. No matter what it costs me. The tension in the room became unbearable when Miriam and Daphne joined Clive and me in a secluded corner of the reception hall. I felt the edge of the situation rising to the limit. Eli stood by, his silent support a comforting anchor in this storm of emotions. I couldn't believe all this was happening, but I had no choice. It couldn't go on any longer. This is going to break us, I breathed out, although I didn't know exactly what I meant. I couldn't figure out what all this was going to lead to, but one thing was clear to me: we were on the verge of something much more than just this wedding reception. What does that mean, Rachel? Miriam hissed, her gaze darting between us, and her lips curled in a grimace of anger. Did you make a scene at your sister's wedding? Aren't you ashamed? I took a deep breath, trying to calm down everything that was bubbling and boiling inside me. The need to defend himself was felt with every word. I think it's time for all of us to stop pretending, I said, as if ripping off the last heavy layer hiding the truth. Lies, manipulations, it all ends there. Daphne's face twisted, she was barely holding back tears. There was a mixture of fear and despair in her eyes, and her voice trembled. Rachel, please. We'll figure it out. Everything will work out. We can handle it. My fingers clenched into a fist, and something inside me sharpened. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. The fact that they lied to me and used this wedding as a smokescreen for their despair stood in front of me like a colossal bitterness. You lied about your financial situation, I said firmly, ignoring the changing expressions on their faces. You used this wedding to hide your disaster. Clive, as always, came forward with his charm, which I once thought was so attractive. But now I could see his smile barely hiding his panic anxiety. Let's not get carried away. Family matters are complicated, he said, trying to regain control of the situation. Save it. Clive, I interrupted him, I know about your attempts to use my company for your own purposes. Do you really think I don't notice that? His eyes darkened for a moment, and I felt the tension in the air become almost tangible. You dare talk to him like that after all we've done for you? Miriam screamed, her voice filled with rage. Did you do it for me? I laughed, and the sound was harsh and bitter. Do you mean the years of emotional abuse, the constant comparisons with Daphne? How did you make me feel like I was never good enough? These words hung in the air like a weight, getting heavier by the moment. I saw the shock on the faces of the nearby guests who stopped to listen. I'm not going to be your scapegoat anymore, I said, and my words sounded firm and determined. I built my life without you. I have succeeded despite all your efforts to break me. Daphne's tears were flowing freely now, her face was distorted with pain. Rachel, please, she begged, but there was a desperation in her voice that I couldn't ignore. Please, we're a family. We need you. I felt a pang of sympathy, but pushed it away from me, as if that look was dangerous. I couldn't afford to fall into that trap again. They had been manipulating me for too long, trying to control my life, and I wasn't going to be a part of their games again. I felt Eli squeeze my hand, giving me his strength. At that moment, I felt like I was Rachel Whitaker. I built a successful company from scratch. I have a loving husband, a wonderful son, and I did all this without counting on the support of people who should have been by my side from the very beginning. The room fell silent. The weight of my words hung in the air like an invisible wall. I saw the faces around me change, shock, admiration, and in some cases, understanding. Miriam's face paled, her carefully constructed image crumbling before her eyes. Daphne looked lost, torn between her devotion to her mother and the harsh truth she had just learned. As for Clive, he was standing there, his charm mask was disappearing, and his plans were crumbling right before my eyes. I took Ali's hand, ready to leave. This wedding is not about a holiday. It was a wedding of lies and despair, and I couldn't be a part of it anymore. As we started to turn to leave, I heard Daphne's broken whisper, "Rachel, wait." But I kept walking without turning around. At that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. The force changed, and I finally took control of my own story. The battle wasn't over yet, I knew it. But when Eli and I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt as if all my shackles had been lifted. I was stronger than ever before. Whatever happened next, I was ready to face it. After my public confrontation with my family, a heavy silence hung in the air like an unbearable tension. Eli and I were heading to the hotel lobby, ready to put this nightmare behind us. But then Miriam's voice broke the silence, filled with anger and despair. "Do you think you can just cut us out of your life?" "Family is not that easy," she warned, her words cutting the air like a knife. I turned to her, and at that moment Eli's hand tightened in mine. He was my anchor, and I felt his support more than ever. I answered without hesitation. "I don't wash anyone, Mom. I'm protecting myself and my family from your toxicity." Clive stepped forward, his facade of charm completely disappeared, and his face took on an expression I hadn't seen before. It was fear. He tried to keep his cool, but his voice faltered as he said, "You have no idea what you're doing, Rachel. Your company's connections can save us all. To save you from..." His gaze darted nervously around the lobby before he bent down and lowered his voice. "I have a problem, Rachel. Big problems. There are people, influential people who can change everything." I saw a glimpse of the sister I once knew, vulnerable, scared, and lost. She stood in front of me like a little girl with nothing else to hide. But I couldn't let it affect me. I couldn't turn back time and fix all the things they had destroyed in my life. "I'm sorry, Daphne," I said quietly but decisively. "But I can't fix it for you. You have to stand on your own 2 feet." Clive, seeing his plans crumbling, took one last desperate step. He grabbed my hand, his eyes were wild with panic, and his voice was hysterical. "You don't understand what's at stake here, Rachel. If I don't fulfill my obligations, there will be consequences for all of us." Eli stepped forward. His voice was low, but full of menace. "Get your hands off my wife," he said, and the danger of the situation was felt in his words. The tension in the lobby was so electrified that it seemed like the air could explode. The hotel staff and the guests who stayed after the wedding watched the unfolding scene with bated breath. Whispers and puzzled glances, all this merged into one huge gloomy picture. I pulled my hand out of Clive's grip and looked him straight in the eye. "Whatever you're confused about, Clive, it's your problem, not mine," I said, feeling every muscle in my body tense and ready to take the plunge. Miriam, realizing that she was losing control of the situation, made a last desperate plea. "Rachel, you can't just leave. We are blood, we are family." I looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in many years. In her eyes, I saw not only anger, but also fear, and something more, despair that her manipulations no longer affect me. She stood in front of me, and I realized that this whole woman who was trying to destroy me had never really known what love was. "Blood doesn't make a family," I replied, holding back my emotions. "Mother, love, support, and respect, that's what makes a family. And you never gave me any of these things." With these words, I felt a heavy weight fall off my shoulders. My freedom has become real, and the choice between my past and future has become more than clear. "Goodbye, Mom," I said, turning to leave. "Goodbye, Daphne. I hope you'll find a way out of this mess, but it won't be through me." Eli and I left the hotel, leaving a shattered world behind us, and stepped into the night air filled with the promise of change. I knew it wasn't over yet. The aftermath of that night will echo for many years, but for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. Whatever happened next, I was ready to face it, on my own terms. The days after Daphne's disastrous wedding were like a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. Everything in my life has changed now. I was sitting in my office, looking out the window at the cityscape, when my assistant announced an unexpected visitor. When the woman came in, I barely recognized her. Its former polished facade was destroyed. Instead, there was a disheveled, broken version of the man who had once been to me, my family. Just then, the door to my office flew open and I saw Miriam, furious, her eyes glittering with malice like sharp knives. She ran into the room, ignoring me, as if I were nothing more than an obstacle on her way to Daphne. "There you are." Her voice was laced with rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This scandal, the shame that you have brought upon our family." I stood up, not letting her get closer, and stood between Miriam and Daphne like an impenetrable wall. "That's enough, Mom," I said calmly, but with such determination that doubt flashed in her eyes. Miriam's eyes widened in shock, and her face paled in surprise. "Are you protecting her after all?" Her words came out full of anger and bewilderment. "I'm not hurting anyone," I replied firmly. "I'm putting an end to this toxic cycle." Miriam couldn't believe that her power was slipping away, and her face was contorted with rage. She took a step forward, as if trying to regain control. "How dare you?" Her voice sounded like a punch. "We sacrificed everything for you girls." "What did Dash sacrifice?" I cut her off abruptly, unable to contain my irritation. "Do you mean the years of manipulation, constant criticism, how you mocked us, forced us to fight against each other?" My voice became as hard as a stone. Daphne, who was standing a little to the side, said quietly but firmly, "She's right, Mom, this has to stop." Miriam looked between us, her gaze darting, and she realized she was losing control. There was real fear in her eyes, and her words became almost inhuman. "You ungrateful children," she hissed. "You have no idea what I've done to protect this family." "To protect you?" I laughed, but it was bitter, like black coffee. "You did nothing but separate us," I replied, feeling all the pain that had accumulated over the years finally coming out. The tension in the room was palpable. Miriam, seeing her influence slipping away, made a last desperate attempt to put everything back in its place. "Rachel, darling, you understand why your sister needs you now. We need you." Her words sounded like a last call, as if she was trying to bring me back into the web she had woven herself. I took a deep breath, but I felt my breath catch in my throat because I didn't need to explain any more. I knew that all Daphne needed was to stand on her own 2 feet. And the mother had to face the consequences of her actions. I couldn't be her victim anymore. "Mother," I said, and the words sounded like a sentence, "what you need is to face reality. I've built my life. I have achieved all this despite all your efforts to restrain me." My voice was getting stronger with every word, and I felt everything coming into harmony inside me. "I'm not going to let you pull me down," I said, feeling reality awaken inside me. Miriam turned pale. Realizing that she was losing power, she made a last, desperate lunge. "You can't just leave your family, Rachel." Her voice became low, full of despair. "We're all you have." I shook my head, and at that moment, peace settled in my heart, as if I had finally found my way. "No, Mother," I said. "You're not all I have. I have a loving husband, a wonderful son, and a life that I built on my own terms." I took a step back, ready to leave this world that was no longer mine. And at that moment, as if in response to my words, the office door opened again. Eli appeared in the doorway, his face showing concern when he saw what was going on. He quickly came up to me, and his presence became a silent anchor for me, which finally brought me back to myself. "The financial fraud has been uncovered." Eli glanced at the report screen, his face frozen in a tense shadow. "Are you going to read this?" His voice was low but insistent. I paused, putting the papers aside, and shook my head. "No, I don't think I will," I replied. "There are too many other things that need attention." Then Caleb knocked sharply on the door. He ran into the room, his face flushed with excitement. "Mom, Dad, look! I can throw the ball very far." he exclaimed, showing us his newfound athletic skills. We raised our eyes to our son with both hands, watching him fiercely demonstrate his strength by throwing a ball into the air. Pride was building in my chest. It was more than just sporting achievements. The look on his confident face reminded me how far he had come. He went through such difficult moments in his life when his health was at risk, and I admired his resilience. It was not just an achievement, it was a symbol of our common victory. "That's amazing, buddy," I said, smiling at him. "Well done." I was glad, pushing thoughts of Daphne and Miriam to the back of my mind. Now, at this moment, we were here, in this house, in this family. At that moment, more than ever, I felt connected to Eli and Caleb. Everything else seemed unimportant. That evening, we received a call from Dr. Caleb. The results of his tests were encouraging. The improvement in his condition was significant. Eli and I exchanged glances, and a relieved smile appeared on each of our faces. This news was like a weight lifted from our shoulders. It was a reminder of what is really important in life, the health and happiness of our family. As we sat at the dinner table, I watched my husband and son, who looked at each other and laughed, discussing the plan of the day. It was my family. Not the toxic relationships of the past, not deceptions and manipulations, but a real, loving, and supportive group of people that we have built together. It was my choice, and I was proud of it. I thought that maybe it was time for us to take that long-awaited vacation that we had been talking about for so long, dreaming of a trip together. "Maybe it's time to take a vacation," I said, breaking the pleasant silence. Eli's face immediately lit up, and he enthusiastically replied, "This is a great idea. What do you think, Caleb? Ready for an adventure?" Our son's response was full of delight. He was happy to throw the ball, as if the whole universe was just waiting for his victories. Laughter and excitement filled the room, and we started planning our trip. Later, when Eli and I were getting ready for bed, he turned to me with a serious expression on his face. "You know, Rachel," he said quietly, "I'm very proud of you, the way you handled everything. You're incredible." I felt a lump in my throat and squeezed his hand. "I couldn't have done it without you," I replied, looking into his eyes. As we lay in silence, I thought about the path that led me to this moment. All my experiences, the pain of childhood, the struggle for freedom from the toxic influence of my family, the difficulties in building a life and career, all this was reunited in this moment of peace and satisfaction. I thought about Daphne and Miriam, and for a moment I wondered how they were doing, what would happen to them. But I realized that it didn't matter. Their choices, their consequences, were no longer my burden. My path was now clear, and that path ran through my own family, my love, and my world. I made a silent promise to myself to always cherish this. And no matter what, I will move forward, greet each new day with a smile, without looking back.